Hello and welcome. In today's video I'm going to show you how to make one of these cute little bags. It's made with denim and some floral cotton print. It's lined with the floral cotton print and has a matching front flap. So let's get started. First you will need to cut out the following pieces of fabric. All the blue pieces are denim and the floral fabric is a cotton print. You will also need the following pieces of interfacing. First, take the two pieces of denim measuring 8 inches by 11 inches and mark a square in the two bottom corners measuring 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. I use a fabric pen to do this, but you could use some dressmaker's chalk. Do the same for both the front and the back of the bag and also the front and back linings. These are the other two pieces measuring 8 by 11 inches, and then cut all of your 1.5 inch squares out. Then take the two pieces of interfacing measuring 8 inches by 11 inches and cut or mark first a square 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches in each corner and cut these out to match the front and back panels. Then cut these corners out. You need two pieces of interfacing, one for the front and one for the back. Then, following the manufacturer's instructions, iron your interfacing onto your front and back panels, making sure you have the shiny side of the interfacing facing down and the wrong side of your fabric facing up. To shape your pocket, mark 1.5 inches at each side from the bottom, remembering that the pocket is 6.5 inches wide but only 5.5 inches deep, so it's along the 5.5 inch side you want to mark off 1.5 inches. Now fold the pocket in half to find the centre, so fold in half and mark the centre point. Then draw a line from each of the side marks to the centre point. Then cut along the two lines you have just drawn and cut the lining fabric to match the denim fabric. To make the pocket, pin the pocket to the lining with right sides facing and then mark an opening of about 2 inches on one side. Sew the pocket together, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish and remembering to leave a gap where you mark the opening. Clip the corners close to the seam but be very careful not to actually cut your stitches, and turn the right side out and use a sharp tool like a knitting needle to push the corners out. Press your pocket using a hot iron and make sure that you turn your seam allowance under where you left the gap. Now we're going to top stitch along the top of the pocket, so just the top edge, not the sides or the bottom, just the top edge. We're going to top stitch about 1/8 inch away from the edge, back tacking at the start and the finish. If you want to, you can do a second row of top stitching about 1/4 inch away from the first row that you did. This is entirely up to you. Next we're going to attach the pocket we've just made to our bag front panel. To do this, fold your front panel of your bag in half to mark the centre and then fold your pocket in half to find the centre of your pocket. Place the pocket on the bag panel matching the centre lines. I also just like to check that it is central by checking I've got the same measurement either side of the pocket. When you're happy with your pocket placement, pin your pocket in place. Now sew your pocket onto the bag panel close to the edge. I like to sew about 1/8 inch from the edge. Back tack at the start and the finish, and remember not to sew over the top opening. Next, pin or clip your front and back panel pieces together with right sides facing. Then sew down the sides and across the bottom, taking 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish, but don't sew around the cut out corners, leave those open. Trim the seams and then we're going to press open the seams. This will make it easier for boxing out the corners, so iron all the seams open. Now put your hand inside the bag and find in the cut out corner, make sure that the bottom seam and the side seam are matched up. Pin or clip in place and do exactly the same on the other side. Sew across both corners, taking 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Trim the seams to about 1/8 inch away from the seam line and then turn the right side out, pushing the corners out using a knitting needle or special tool. And that's our bag body finished for now. Next, pin or clip your front and back pieces of lining fabric together and mark an opening of about 3 inches in the centre of the bottom edge. Sew the front and back lining pieces together, taking a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. And remember not to sew between the marks that we left for our opening. And don't sew around the corner cutouts, just the 2 sides and the bottom. Now press the seams open. I've decided not to trim these seams because it's a nice light cotton and there's not too much bulk, so I'm just going to press the seams open. Next we need to box out the corners, so put your hand inside the lining, find the opening and make sure you line up your side and bottom seams and clip in place. Do the same for both sides. Now sew, taking a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Do the same for both sides. Trim the seams to about 1/8 of an inch from the seam line. Press the seams. Now take the bag flap, lining and main piece. These are the pieces that measure 9 inches by 6 inches, and measure to find the centre and put a mark in the centre. Then measure 1.5 inches from the top side on each side and put a mark. Now draw a line from each side to the centre mark. I folded my fabric in half before cutting just to make it a bit easier, but you can cut up one side then the other, it's up to you. Pin or clip the flap to the lining with right sides facing and mark a gap on the top edge 2 to 3 inches wide for turning the right side out. Sew the flap and lining together, taking a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish, and remember not to sew between the opening marks. Now turn the bag flap the right side out through the 3 inch opening that we left. You might need to use a pointed tool or a knitting needle to push out the corners. Now press, making sure the opening is nicely turned under. Top stitch all around the sides, but not the top edge. Back tacking at the start and the finish. Sew about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. To attach the bag flap, find the centre of the bag. I did this by measuring to see the width of the back of the bag and then dividing that by 2 to find the centre. So my bag measured 10 inches, so the centre was 5 inches. I did exactly the same to the bag flap. I measured it just a fraction over 8 inches, so the centre was just over 4 inches. Then with the right side of the flap facing the right side of the bag and lining up the 2 centre marks, I pinned together. Sew the bag flap in place, taking a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Now take the tabs and the tab linings and pin them or clip them together with right sides facing. Sew down the sides of each tab, taking a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Trim the seams to about 1/4 of an inch from the seam line and then turn the right way out. To do this, I thread a piece of cord down the centre of the strip, sew across the top and then pull the cord through. It makes it a lot easier to turn thin strips the right way out. Now press the tabs, rolling the sides to get a nice even edge and making sure there's none of the denim showing over the floor fabric, or indeed the other way round. Do exactly the same to both of the tabs. Then top stitch down each side about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, back tacking at the start and the finish. Thread the tabs through the D-rings with the denim on the outside, unless you would prefer to have a floral fabric on the outside. Then clip or pin in place. Do exactly the same to both of the tabs. Then measure 1.5 inches from the top of the tab. This is a mark to indicate where to line up with the top of the bag. Of course, if you wanted to, you could just cut the excess fabric off, but this is the way I did it. I put a mark and then lined it up with the top of the bag. When you are happy with the placement of the tabs, pin or clip in place. Remember to line the centre of the tabs up with the central seam down the side of the bag. Sew both the tabs to the bag, taking a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Do the same to both sides. Next, I trimmed off the excess fabric in my tabs. To attach the lining to the bag, you want your lining the wrong side out and your bag facing the right side out. So that makes the right side of the lining facing the right side of the bag. When you've done this, you need to clip or pin all the way around. I match the seams at the sides first before continuing to pin or clip the rest of the bag. The flaps and the tabs should all be facing down inside the bag. Now sew all the way around the bag, taking a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. You'll find this job easier if you remove your sewing machine's extension table. Turn your bag the right side out through the hole you left in the lining. So pull all the bag through the hole until it's all the right side out. Use a pointed object to push out the corners, or use a special tool if you have one. Knitting needles come in quite handy for this job. Pin or clip the lining closed at this point. We'll sew it later. Give the bag a good ironing and press the edges down, because we're going to top stitch around the edge, so make sure that all the lining fabric is on the inside so it won't be seen when you top stitch around the top. Now top stitch all the way around the top of the bag, about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, back tacking at the start and the finish. You can either slip stitch the opening closed, or you can sew it on your machine. I'm choosing to slip stitch it. If you want to slip stitch, I do have a separate video on how to slip stitch. Otherwise, just sew it on your machine. The next job is to add a fastening. I'm using metal poppers. So the first thing I do is find the centre of the flap. So I put the popper in the centre. Once I've found the centre, I'm going to mark a hole with the tool provided. I then push the top side of the popper through the hole that I made, place it down on the backing tool, and then using the tool I hammer through the centre of the popper, which then holds the popper in place. I then find the centre of the front panel by folding the bag in half and marking the centre line. Then I close the bag and I have a rough idea of where I need to mark where the other popper is going to go. Then using the tool provided, I make a hole for the other side of the popper to go and thread through the back of the popper. I then use a different tool and hammer the other side of the popper into place. And that's my popper finish. Of course, you may have different poppers with different instructions. Follow your manufacturer's instructions. All that we need to do now is to make the strap. Take your length of fabric, and first we're going to fold the ends over. So fold the end over by about 1/4 of an inch. You can do a little bit more if you wish, but I'm doing about 1/4 of an inch. Iron that in place and do exactly the same at the other end. Then fold your strip in half lengthways. What we're doing here is marking the centre of the piece of fabric. So fold it in half and then with your iron mark a crease down the centre. Go all the way along the whole length of the piece of fabric. Next, take the outer edge of the fabric and fold it into the centre of the fabric, using the crease you made earlier as a guide. Then do exactly the same on the other side, folding the other side into the centre to meet the side that you've already folded over. All the way along, continue to the end. Now fold the strip in half down the central line again, and this should bring the width down to 1 inch, which is exactly what you want. Iron as you go along and then put some clips in. Take over to the sewing machine and sew 1/8 of an inch away from the edge on each side. Use the 1/8 of an inch guide on your foot plate to help you keep a nice straight line. I tend to just let the fabric move through my fingers, so I hold them steady and then just let the fabric move through, and it tends to keep a nice straight line. Now you have your finished strap, so let's start threading it up. First, take your slider and thread your strap through the slider. So we go up through the slider, down over the central bar, pull it through, and it should look like this. Now we need to secure the slider in place. So fold over about 1.5 inches and either clip or pin in place. I'm going to use clips. Now sew the slider in its position. You can either sew backwards and forwards a couple of times to secure it in place, or if you prefer, you can sew a square with a cross in the centre, like I'm doing. Next, attach the D-ring with the lobster clasp, making sure that the strap is all facing the same side up. Now take the end of the strap without the slider, and with all the strap facing the right way, thread through the slider, go up one side and down the other. Pull through, and that's your slider all fitted and working. Next, attach the other lobster D-ring to the open end of your strap. Do exactly the same as you did with the slider. Leave about 1.5 inches turned over and then pin or clip in place. Now sew the D-ring and lobster clasp to the strap in the same way as we sewed the slider. Either sew backwards and forwards several times, or do like I'm doing and sew a box with a cross in the centre. Attach your strap to your bag and you should have something that looks a little bit like this. Thank you very much for watching my video. I do hope you managed to make one of these lovely little bags. If you have enjoyed my video, could you please like and subscribe? Thank you.